Hi. Well, David Miliband needs almost no introduction. Former UK Foreign Secretary, former Environment Minister, left politics a few years ago after a contentious battle with his younger brother for leadership of the Labour Party, and now is based in New York as the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, a global humanitarian organization. So I think it makes sense to start by talking about the refugee crisis, something you've been very deeply involved in and recently testified about. You were saying to me earlier that you feel like there's been an inflection point reached. Describe that to me. Why is that happening?
Yeah, I think that over the last 3 or 4 weeks, the scale as well as the complexity of the global refugee crisis has not just hit TV screens and newspaper headlines, it's also hit the consciousness of people. Remember, last year set a grisly world record, 20 million refugees leaving their own homes, but also crossing the boundaries of their own country into a neighboring state, and 40 million homeless in their own country as a result of war and disaster. So that 60 million figure has never been reached before. And organizations like ours have been making the argument that this is a moral cause, but it also has geopolitical implications in the Middle East and elsewhere, and we've frankly found it very difficult to make the argument. I think that the scenes that people have seen in Europe, I was in Greece last week on the island where half of the refugees are arriving in Europe, represents an inflection point where people are saying, what can be done, what can I do? And I think that's very, very significant and very important, because last year, the Pope was in Lampedusa in Italy, which is one of the Italian islands, and he talked about the globalization of indifference. It speaks directly to what Senator Booker was just saying. And my sense is that that sense of indifference has been broken over the last 2 or 3 weeks.
And so what does that mean? What does the future hold?
Well, I think the future at the moment is that the wave of refugees and internally displaced people is a trend and not a blip. If you think, why is it happening? Why should there be this remarkable situation that the world has never been more peaceful when measured by wars between states? There are actually no hot wars between states at the moment. What there are is civil wars within states, 25 to 30 of them. And that's being driven, on the one hand, by huge convulsion in the Muslim world. Secondly, weak states around the world that aren't able to hold the ring on political and ethnic difference. The newest state in the world is South Sudan, 10 million people, 4 million in food insecurity, 30,000 killed in the civil war. And third, to be honest, a weak and divided international system that no longer is providing an anchor against civil war and the conflicts at the heart. And I think that's, to me, those three factors seem like a trend and not a blip. And so then the question for us is twofold. One, what can humanitarians do? And we can talk about the difference that a humanitarian organization can make in the front line. But I always say to people, humanitarian NGOs can staunch the dying, and that's vital, but it takes politics to stop the killing. And so we're going to see that dualism playing out with more and more humanitarian effort in the front line, hopefully to greater effect because the humanitarian sector needs to be reformed, but a real challenge to politics, which is becoming more complex and more difficult, as you see with the Syria situation every day. Well,
do you think this could have been prevented with more aggressive...
What could have been prevented?
The situation in Syria.
Yeah, I don't think anyone, if you think back 4.5 years and you said, is it inevitable that there'll be 300,000 dead, 4.5 million refugees, 12.5 million homeless and in humanitarian need in the country, if you'd said, is that inevitable? No, I think to believe that is to fall into a terrible culture of pessimism. So I don't think there's an inevitability that the Syrian state was going to break in the way that it has.
But in terms of you had called for military intervention, for example.
I haven't actually. I haven't. I've been very careful. I'm the leader of a humanitarian organization, and I've got my own staff on the ground in Syria and elsewhere, and I'm very careful about what I say. What I always say to people, though, is that when you're weighing the risks of action, you also have to weigh the risks of inaction.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important that as a humanitarian organization, we're able to speak to the fact that political failure is driving the scale of death and destruction in Syria at the moment. We've got to summon a real sense of moral conscience that action needs to be taken to ensure that where there are wars, at a minimum, they're conducted according to the norms of international humanitarian law. Because remember, the war in Syria doesn't just look like a war without end at the moment, it looks like a war without law. And that's because a government is dropping barrel bombs on its own citizens. in total contravention of international humanitarian law. So one has to stand up for the idea that there are humanitarian actions that are necessary and can be taken without trespassing into the realm of saying, this is my view on military tactics, because that wouldn't be appropriate for me to say that.
In terms of the response to the crisis, do you think that the U.S. is currently doing enough?
No, there's no question not. I mean, there are three ways of thinking about it, really. One, what is the US doing to resettle refugees? So far, 1,800 Syrian refugees have been admitted to the United States in 4 years. Historically, the US has been a global leader in refugee resettlement, so no way is the US living up to its traditions. I mean, I always say to people, it's harder to get into the US as a refugee than any other means, perhaps except swimming across the Atlantic. It's probably more difficult to swim across the Atlantic than to get in as a refugee, but it's very, very difficult to get in as a refugee. Second thing that the US is doing, where it's got a better record, is obviously in respect of the support that's been offered for humanitarian help inside Syria and in the neighboring states, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. And just to give people a sense of this, I think this is important. Jordan is one of the closest allies of the United States in the Middle East. It's got a population of 6 million, and it's got 700,000 registered refugees. You can immediately see the percentage. It's like the whole of England, not the whole of the United Kingdom, the whole of England coming to the United States in the space of 4 years. And the American government has offered about $4.5 billion of humanitarian help inside Syria and in the neighboring states. But in the face of the scale of the problem, you'd have to say there needs to be a bigger global coalition, not just more American spending, more spending overall. And then obviously on the political track, almost the worst thing that's confronting us is not just the death and the destruction, but the fact that this civil war has no current live political process to bring it to a close. I mean, if you think back to the wars in the Balkans in the 90s, there were failed political processes, but at least there were political processes, which eventually, with a combination of politics and military action, brought the wars to a close. And so I think that there's a real sense that the Syria war is something that has been in the too difficult box for too many governments in too many parts of the world.
What do you make of the current escalation by Russia?
Well, I think that I'd say a couple of things about it. The first is that my instinct is that it's born originally of the weakness of the Assad regime. Obviously, Russia has been a very strong ally of President Assad over the last 4 years, and they haven't felt the need to have the kind of active military presence that they've got at the moment. And so I think the decision they took 3 or 4 weeks ago reflects the weakness of the Assad regime. Secondly, and obviously, it severely complicates all of the discussions that are happening about no-fly zones, no bombing zones, and the rest of it. And that, I think, is very significant, notably for the people that we're trying to serve in the country. What it means for the long-term future, I think, is open. What it clearly is a big power play. It's a very big geopolitical, geodiplomatic power play by Russia to say, to the extent that there's a vacuum there, we're going to make sure we're going to partly fill it.
Well, Ben Rhodes, the Deputy National Security Advisor, was here yesterday, and he said that Syria will never be stable as long as Assad is still in power. Do you agree with that?
I think that there are two aspects to this. One is that Assad has waged war on his own people, and there are millions of Syrians who believe and feel to their absolute core that there can never be stability there. But equally, the other side of the coin is that there are a range of so-called rebel and other groups who are also destabilizing the country. The people I met in Greece last week, they just said to me, look, I'm living in Aleppo, I'm an engineering student in Greater Damascus, I'm running a business in Deir az-Zor, which is in the east of the country. And they said, there's twin terror in Syria that's made me leave my country. I've got barrel bombs from Assad on the one hand, or I'm being conscripted into Assad's army, which is what some of the younger engineering students said to me. And on the other hand, I've got the terror of ISIS. And so I think that there's a pincer movement, and you've got to recognize both sides as absolutely critical to the desperate insecurity that's there at the moment.
I want to switch gears to American politics a little bit, because you worked closely with Hillary Clinton, got to know her very well as her counterpart. So now that she's running, of course, the American political press is spilling all kinds of ink, basically psychoanalyzing her.
All kinds of what?
Ink. Well,
ink.
Metaphorical ink. We
I see,
don't.
yeah.
It's all pixels now. But a lot of pixels spent sort of trying to figure her out, and is she trustworthy, so on and so forth. What, in your dealings with her, did you feel that you could trust her, and what was?
Yeah, completely. I mean, look, I'm obviously not. I'm not a voter, so I'm not going to. At least you can't ask me who I'm going to vote for. But what I would say is that one thing that people don't see in politicians, and I didn't expect, frankly. I was in office from 2007 to 2010 as Secretary of State, and Hillary Clinton came in January 2009. One of the most striking things to me was how good a listener she was. Lots of politicians are good speakers, good talkers, but she was a really good listener, and I thought she had a seriousness of purpose that was very, very striking to me, and that was my, if you ask me for my greatest reflection on working with her, I would say that was a very striking quality.
It doesn't sound like much fun.
It was great, actually. You just have to read what she said. You can Google what she said. It was we had a lot of fun, yeah.
Well, and there was an email released yesterday where she was analyzing your loss, and she blamed it on.
I didn't know this. You've
yeah,
done
this
more
is a new
research
email
than
from
I
yesterday.
have.
I'm about to tell you about it for the first time. She's emailing with Sid Blumenthal, and she's just gotten the news of what happened in the Labor election, and she blames it on Tony Blair. She wrote, quote, "Clearly more about Tony than David or Ed." Do you agree with that analysis?
Oh, look, you can't start blaming election defeats on other people. I mean, you've got to just take it for yourself. I think that what's very, very significant for someone who's someone with a visa, but nonetheless living in the country, working in the country, the next year, I think, is going to be fascinating for me for a number of reasons. But one, I think, is really important, and maybe for an American audience is interesting to hear. Obviously, you've got your own issues that you need to sort out at home. Quote unquote, nation building at home matters, and you've just been hearing about this huge criminal justice reform issue. You've got other issues. But certainly if you live in any other part of the world, the most striking feature of the modern world is that domestic policy has to be allied with foreign policy. We live in an interdependent world. The cliche about a global village is true. And in a village, if your neighbor's house is on fire, then your own house is on fire. And I will be interested in how, over the next year, foreign policy moves from being something that's out there and nothing to do with us to being part of the discourse. Because it seems to me that the successful politics of the modern world aligns national, domestic, internal priorities with the external, whether it be in respect of trade or the environment and climate change or security. Those have got to be part of the narrative, and I think that we're having our own struggle with that in the UK at the moment with the debate about Europe. But I think that, for me, the West, countries of the West, we were the big authors of this phase of globalization, partly political, partly economic. And for the West to turn its back on globalization, yes, let's make it fairer, yes, let's make it more sustainable, yes, let's make it more stable, but for Western countries to turn inwards and turn away from globalization, I think is very dangerous.
Well, but you mentioned the debate about Europe, and we're having our own debate in this country, and we had Donald Trump saying the other day he's going to send all the refugees home if they ever get here. Isn't it also a moment when people are very fearful of being displaced and people do want to turn inward and away from? Well,
it's not going to make America great again to send home all the refugees. I mean, because remember, what is a refugee? A refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution. And what has this country offered? Well, as it happens, I went to junior high school for a year in the United States at the age of 12 or 13, and I learned there about the idea and the ideals that founded this country and that have built this country. And one of them is that people who have a well-founded fear of persecution can find a home here. And I live in New York, and you know, we always take, when people come and visit, you go on the Staten Island ferry and you look at the Statue of Liberty and you're told, it says, "Bring me your poor and huddled masses." And it says that for a reason. That's not an invitation to confuse a refugee with an immigrant. And one of the things about this debate that is a lesson from Europe is when the debate about immigration becomes confused with the debate about refugees, that's dangerous. the integrity of the status of a refugee as someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution, has rights in international law, and imposes obligations on states around the world, that is a precious product of the horrors of the 20th century, and the 1951 Geneva Convention that instituted the rights of refugees is something that we have to hold on to. Every country needs an immigration policy, and there'll be discussion about the appropriate immigration policy. But for refugees and the rights, actually the absolute rights that they have, the rights to protection in the face of persecution, I think is incredibly important to hang on to.
At some point, though, don't they become immigrants? I mean, how do you handle when you have a very large number of people coming into a new country? Isn't that a challenge to assimilate those people, to find
Yes,
a place
it is,
for
but
them
remember,
in society?
America takes 70,000 refugees a year at the moment, and you're a country of 360 million people. Germany is a country of 90 million people and has just announced it's going to take 500,000 asylum claims each year. I saw the Prime Minister of Italy on Tuesday. His country, 60 million people, he's leading a big reform of the economy to try and strengthen the country. 120,000 people arriving per year in Italy as refugees. And yes, you have to have a proper process. Europe has sent home 98,000 people last year who didn't qualify as refugees. They didn't qualify as people who had a well-founded fear of persecution. But of course there are issues about how you integrate people into the local community. But I mean, this country, above all others, has shown how you do it well. My organization, we spend most of our effort, about 7/8 of our budget is international work in 30 war-torn countries around the world. But in 26 US cities, we resettle 10,000 refugees a year. And the truth is that they become extraordinarily patriotic and productive Americans because they are working, they're getting their kids an education, and they feel always, in my experience, a huge sense of pride, but also a sense of thanks for what this country has offered them. And I think that given the experience here of helping people become productive citizens, given the DNA tests and all the rest of it that can go through that goes into the security vetting for people to come in, it's not right to have the fear that somehow these people are going to poison the country. They're actually going to be productive citizens of the country.
Well, in the few minutes that we have left, I do want to go back to UK politics because I need someone to explain to me what is going on with the Labour Party. Can you explain that to me?
How long have you got? I mean, you've got. Unfortunately, there's only 2 minutes.
You're going to run out the clock, aren't you?
Look, I think the way to understand European politics, I think, has some parallels in the US, which is that centre-right and centre-left candidates in all countries are finding it hard to get traction. And they're being outflanked, you can think about it in your own politics, by people who are left of centre or right of centre rather than centre-right and centre-left. And what's the reason? I think it comes back to this globalisation question, that for the centre-right, they're finding it very hard to answer the call of their supporters to conserve social order in the face of globalisation that they embrace. And on the left, the centre-left, the question is, how in the face of an embrace of globalisation do you limit inequality? And I think that's the prism through which I would understand the changes that are going on across European politics as well as in American politics, that the challenge for centre-right and centre-left is to show on the centre-left that actually governments can lead change that doesn't just make the economy more productive, but actually limits inequality. And on the centre-right, there are challenges of how to answer the concerns of supporters for continued social order. And obviously in the UK now we have a fixed-term parliament system, so we're right at the beginning of the parliament. General election last May that the Conservatives won, and so that debate is roiling at the moment.
And do you support Corbyn?
I always vote Labour. I mean, it's easy for me to answer that question because I'm a sort of Labour person to my core, but I'm at the moment living in America, so I'm not a participant in UK politics. I'm an observer of UK politics.
There's been some talk, though, about your potential return. Is that something you're contemplating?
No. I mean, I'm totally focused in the middle of this gargantuan refugee crisis. I'm running an organization with 21,000 staff in 35 countries and 26 US cities, and we are in the front line. As governments and international agencies withdraw, we're in the front line. And we're in the front line from Aleppo and Damascus right through into the neighboring states. We're in Afghanistan, we're in Greece, and we're resettling in the US. We're seeing the whole arc of crisis from beginning to end. And frankly, that is completely consuming of my attention and my activity.
You're getting phone calls, though?
Well, I haven't lost my friends, if that's what you're asking. But if you're saying
What are they
I
saying
haven't
to you?
become a non-person, and am I getting phone calls about going back into British politics?
Yes.
No, I'm not.
Really?
No, I'm not. I mean, they're phoning you more than they're phoning me, obviously, by the...
All of your
what
friends
people are saying to
somehow
me,
got
of course people are in touch with me. And they're talking about how does Labour recover from a devastating general election loss. And they're talking to me about, I saw you on the news from Greece. I see that you've got people going on. We've got a massive crisis going on in Europe. What do you think we should do? And so people are actually respectful and interested in what I'm doing, as well as what I think.
All right. David Miliband, thank you so much.
Thank you.